Content warning. This story contains historical discussions of human remains, medical practices involving the dead, and themes of bodily exploitation. While presented in an educational and respectful context, some material may be disturbing to sensitive viewers. There are no graphic descriptions, but the subject matter is uncomfortable. Take a deep breath. When you're ready, we'll begin. The body as commodity. Before we begin, I want you to sit with something uncomfortable. Not horror, not violence, just a question. What is a human body worth? Not spiritually, not emotionally, not symbolically. Financially, practically, industrially. For most of human history, the body was sacred. It was washed, dressed, mourned, buried with ritual. Even in poverty, there were rites. Even in war, there were prayers. But beneath those rituals, beneath the hymns and the dirt and the polished wood of coffins, there has always been another current running quietly through civilization. A calculating one. Because a body is not only memory. It is material. Bone, muscle, skin, and fat. Fat, soft, pale, unassuming, layered beneath the surface like insulation in a wall. It warms. It cushions. It preserves. And when rendered, it burns. It lubricates. It becomes useful. In candlelight flickering across 18th century walls, in soap lathering against Victorian hands, in ointments rubbed into aching joints, fat was not sentiment. It was substance. And history, when stripped of romance, has always been practical. When cities grew crowded and burial grounds overflowed, when medical schools demanded cadavers, when industry required oil and tallow, when war strained resources, the line between reverence and resource began to blur. Quietly. No dramatic speeches, no official declarations. Just whispers, just necessity, just the slow, rational thought. If the living need it, and the dead cannot protest, then what is truly being lost? In the narrow streets of London, where fog pressed against brick and gas lamps hissed in the damp night air, bodies moved from grave to table under cover of darkness. In the colder districts of Edinburgh, anatomy theaters filled with eager students while the earth above them settled back into place. In parts of Central Europe, executioners were known to collect more than just rope and blade. They harvested what they believed could heal. And in times of panic, of famine, of industrial desperation, rumors spread that even flesh itself was being melted down, rendered, repackaged, sold. Sometimes those rumors were lies, sometimes they were propaganda, and sometimes they were close enough to truth to make people afraid to ask questions. This is not a story about monsters in the dark. It is a story about utility, about what happens when human beings begin to see the body not as sacred remains, but as inventory. Because the shift does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. A grave robbed here, a cadaver sold there, an ointment labeled vaguely, an industrial vat that smells a little too sweet, and no one wants to look too closely. The air grows heavy not because of what is visible, but because of what is rationalized. Because when survival, profit, or progress enter the room, morality rarely leaves in protest. It negotiates. Tonight, we are not chasing folklore. We are not indulging in sensationalism. We are opening a quieter drawer in the archive, one that contains ledger books, medical notes, wartime rumors, and half-buried testimonies. This is the story of a trade that hovered at the edge of respectability, a practice that flickered between medicine, industry, and myth, a question that forced societies to decide what a human body truly meant once breath had left it, and whether flesh, once lifeless, still deserved dignity. This is the story of the human fat thieves. If you're drawn to the strange corners of history, the stories that feel too unsettling to be taught in classrooms but too important to ignore, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories from Story Vault Buried Truths. Because some histories are not lost, they are simply unspoken. Now, let's step carefully. The ground beneath us has been disturbed before. Chapter 1. The Medical Hunger for Bodies. Progress is rarely clean. We like to imagine the advancement of medicine as noble, candlelit laboratories, brilliant minds, breakthroughs that saved lives. And in many ways it was. But progress has always had an appetite. And in the 18th and early 19th centuries, that appetite was for bodies. Real ones, fresh ones, whole ones. Across Europe, anatomy was becoming essential to medical training. Surgeons could no longer rely on theory or illustrated texts alone. If a physician was going to cut into the living, he had to understand what lay beneath the skin. And the only way to learn that was to open the dead. In cities like London and Edinburgh, medical schools were expanding rapidly. Students packed into anatomy theaters, tiered wooden galleries rising steeply above a central dissection table. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sour undertone of decay. Windows were often kept cracked, even in winter. On the table below lay the foundation of modern medicine, a human body. By law, however, there was a problem. In Britain, only the corpses of executed criminals could be legally dissected. That might sound sufficient until you consider that executions were relatively limited and medical schools were multiplying. By the early 1800s, there were far more students than there were hanging bodies. Demand exceeded supply, and whenever that imbalance exists, a market forms. They were called resurrectionists, a polite term for grave robbers. Under cover of darkness, men armed with shovels and ropes slipped into churchyards. Fresh graves were targeted, the soil still loose, the mourning flowers not yet wilted. The process was swift and disturbingly efficient. They did not steal coffins. They did not take jewelry. They took the body. The corpse was hoisted out, stripped of burial garments to avoid theft charges, and transported to anatomy schools before dawn. By morning, families had no idea. And the earth above the grave had been smoothed over, as though nothing had been disturbed. It is difficult to overstate the fear this created. In working-class neighborhoods, families began guarding graves for nights after burial. Iron cages called mort safes were placed over coffins to prevent disturbance. Watchmen were hired. Guns were kept close. Because for the poor, death did not guarantee rest. It made you valuable. The notorious case of William Burke and William Hare in 1828 shocked the public not merely because of murder, but because of what motivated it. Instead of digging up the dead, they realized something simpler. Why wait for someone to die? They supplied fresh corpses directly to anatomist Dr. Robert Knox in Edinburgh. 16 victims smothered and sold. The scandal forced society to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Medical science was not only studying death, it was incentivizing it. Now here is where the air shifts slightly. Because once a body arrived at the anatomy theater, its purpose expanded. It was no longer a person, it was instruction. Incisions were made, organs examined, muscles separated from bone, tissue peeled back layer by layer. Fat, the pale yellowish layer beneath the skin, was not the focus of study. It was simply there, surrounding, padding, present. But it did not go unnoticed. At a time when animal fat was already being rendered for candles, soap, and lubricants, the chemical properties of human fat were understood to be similar. It burned, it melted, it could be processed. Most anatomical fat was discarded as waste. Most. But not all institutions operated under strict oversight, and not all environments were governed by idealism. When bodies were obtained cheaply or illegally, the incentive to extract every usable component grew stronger. There are scattered accounts from the era suggesting that in certain cases, fat removed during dissections was collected rather than discarded, sometimes for experimental chemical study, sometimes for medicinal preparation, sometimes simply because it had potential value. Nothing was formally industrialized, but nothing was entirely sacred either. The shift is subtle but important. When a body is framed as educational material, it becomes easier to compartmentalize it, to divide it, to reduce it. The wealthy were rarely dissected. Their funerals were elaborate, their coffins reinforced, their graves guarded. But in overcrowded workhouses, hospitals, and prisons, the unclaimed dead were vulnerable. They became inventory, and the medical community defended it as necessary, which in many ways it was. Modern surgery, anatomy textbooks, and life-saving procedures were built on these studies. Countless lives were saved because physicians learned by cutting into the dead. That is the paradox. Progress requires knowledge. Knowledge required bodies. Bodies required acquisition, and acquisition blurred into exploitation. No one set out declaring, "We will commodify the human form." It happened gradually, one shortage at a time, one quiet transaction at a time, one rationalization at a time. The hunger for bodies was not born of cruelty alone. It was born of ambition, curiosity, and the belief that the advancement of the living justified the disassembly of the dead. But once you begin to see the body as material for study, it becomes easier, dangerously easier, to see it as material for use. And that is where our story darkens, because medicine was only one force pressing against the boundary of human sanctity. Industry was rising, chemistry was advancing, war was looming, and the question lingered in the background, barely whispered but quietly persistent. If a body can be opened for knowledge, what else can it become? We are only at the beginning. The hunger had been established, and history, as we'll see, rarely lets an appetite go unfed. Chapter 2: Corpse Medicine and the belief in healing flesh. Before laboratories were sterile, before pharmaceuticals were synthesized in glass vials, before clinical trials and regulatory boards and printed warning labels, there was belief. And belief, when wrapped in tradition, can feel like science. For centuries across Europe, the human body was not only something to bury, it was something to use. Not in secret covens, not in hidden cults, in pharmacies, in marketplaces, in respectable medical practice. This was the era of what historians now call corpse medicine, and it was not fringe, it was mainstream. Powdered skull was prescribed for headaches and epilepsy. Blood from executed criminals was consumed for vitality. Moss scraped from human skulls, known as usnea, was dried and sold to stop nosebleeds. And then there was fat, soft, pliable, unassuming. Human fat, rendered carefully over low heat, became a medicinal ointment believed to soothe aching joints, heal bruises, and treat rheumatism. In parts of German-speaking Europe, executioners occupied a strange position in society. They were feared, socially isolated, often forced to live on the outskirts of town. But they were also necessary. And in cities like Vienna and Berlin, executioners were sometimes quietly regarded as suppliers of medicinal materials. When a criminal was put to death, particularly by hanging or breaking on the wheel, the body was not always immediately buried. It could be claimed, portions of it at least. There are documented cases of executioners rendering fat from the bodies of the condemned and selling it as Armsunderfett, literally, poor sinner's fat. The name alone carries weight. It suggests something almost poetic, the suffering of the condemned transformed into healing for the living. The logic was rooted in sympathetic magic, the belief that properties could transfer from one body to another. A violent death was thought to concentrate life force. The fat, taken from someone who had died suddenly, was believed to hold potency. To modern ears, it sounds like superstition wrapped in morbidity. But at the time, it was medicine. People lined up to purchase it. Ointments were rubbed into swollen knees, into twisted ankles, into aching backs hardened by labor. There was no sense of scandal, only relief. And beneath that relief, a quiet normalization. Because once the body becomes treatment, it ceases to be untouchable. In early modern apothecaries, jars were labeled plainly. Preparations made from human materials were not hidden behind curtains. They were part of a broader pharmacological landscape that also included herbs, animal fats, minerals, and metals. The body was nature, and nature was to be utilized. There was also an unsettling practicality to it. In a world without modern anesthetics, antibiotics, or anti-inflammatory drugs, pain was constant. Chronic illness was common. If a salve rendered from human fat appeared to reduce suffering, whether through placebo effect or simple emollient properties, it earned legitimacy. Ethics, as we understand them today, were not the framework. Effectiveness was. And so demand persisted. Not in massive factories, not in organized cartels, but in small, quiet exchanges. A coin passed to an executioner, a jar wrapped in cloth, a remedy carried home under candlelight. There is something deeply human about this chapter of history. Not cruelty, exactly. Desperation. Hope. The desire to ease pain, even if the source of that relief required crossing a boundary we would now consider sacred. And yet there is a shadow here, because executioners did not always have surplus bodies. Executions fluctuated. Some years were sparse. And when supply is unpredictable, rumors begin. Whispers spread of stolen corpses, of fresh graves disturbed, of bodies taken before families could claim them. Were these widespread practices? No. Were they isolated? Not entirely. Documentation from the period is fragmented, but enough exists to confirm that human-derived medicinal materials were real. Enough to confirm that body fat was indeed collected, rendered, and sold in certain regions well into the 18th century. What began as ritual and belief gradually intersected with commerce. And commerce does something belief alone does not. It incentivizes. The moment a body part acquires price, it acquires vulnerability. Now pause here. Feel that shift. This is not yet industrial exploitation. This is something quieter, more intimate. A world in which pain relief outweighed philosophical discomfort. A world in which the boundary between sacred and practical was thinner than we might like to admit. It is easy to judge from a distance of centuries, but consider this. If you lived in a time of constant physical labor, if your joints throbbed in winter, if your child cried from chronic pain, if a local apothecary offered something believed to help, would you refuse it on principle? Or would you accept it quietly, without asking too many questions? Corpse medicine faded gradually as modern chemistry advanced. By the 19th century, many physicians began rejecting such remedies as unscientific. The Enlightenment demanded measurable evidence. Industrial pharmaceuticals replaced folk preparations. But the legacy remained. Because for generations, people had internalized a subtle idea. The human body, even after death, contains value, transferable value, usable value. And once that concept takes root in a culture, it does not disappear easily. It lingers, it evolves, it waits for moments of crisis to resurface. The belief in healing flesh was not born from malice, it was born from suffering. But suffering, when combined with market forces and limited regulation, can open doors that are difficult to close. The body had become remedy. Soon, in other contexts, it would become resource. And history would ask the same question again. If it can heal, what else can it do? We are only beginning to see how far that reasoning can travel. Chapter 3. Adipocere and the Science of Body Fat. There is a moment in death that feels final. The last breath, the stillness, the silence in a room that was once alive. But the body does not end when breath does. It changes, quietly, chemically, inevitably. And sometimes it transforms into something unexpected. In the late 18th century, as modern chemistry was beginning to take shape, scientists became fascinated not just with life, but with decomposition. What exactly happened to flesh in the grave? Why did some bodies decay into dust while others hardened? In damp, oxygen-poor environments, marshes, sealed coffins, flooded graves, human fat undergoes a strange chemical transformation. Instead of rotting away, it turns waxy, gray-white, soap-like, almost preserved. The substance was eventually named adipocere, from the Latin adeps, fat, cera, wax, fat wax, grave wax. The name itself sounds clinical, but the reality is unsettling.
Adipocere forms when body fat breaks down through hydrolysis and hydrogenation, creating a substance composed largely of fatty acids. The moisture slows typical decomposition. Bacteria interact differently. Instead of liquefying into putrefaction, fat solidifies. It can preserve facial features, preserve skin folds, preserve hands. Time stops differently inside adipocere. And for early chemists, this was not horror, it was discovery. The late 1700s and early 1800s were a period of chemical revolution. Figures like Antoine Lavoisier were redefining how matter itself was understood. Combustion was no longer mystical, it was measurable. Elements were catalogued, reactions were recorded. Fat was no longer just substance, it was chemistry. Scientists studied animal tallow to understand candle efficiency. They examined oils to improve lubrication for machinery. Soap production was becoming increasingly refined through chemical processes. And somewhere within this growing body of research, human fat entered the conversation, not as folklore, not as medicine, but as material. Adipocere intrigued researchers because it blurred the line between decay and preservation. Reports surfaced from cemeteries where bodies exhumed years later appeared strangely intact. In 1786, a mass grave at the Cimetière des Innocents in Paris revealed bodies partially transformed into this waxy substance, astonishing observers. It challenged assumptions. Decay was not uniform. The human body could become something stable, something solid, something chemically resilient.
And in an age obsessed with categorization, that mattered. Industrial chemistry was advancing rapidly through the 19th century. Factories required lubricants. Urban populations demanded soap. Candle production remained essential before widespread gaslighting. Fat, animal fat primarily, was rendered in large vats. It was melted, purified, separated into usable components. Stearic acid, glycerin, tallow. These words began to populate factory ledgers. The Industrial Revolution was not sentimental. It was pragmatic. Materials were valued for function, output, efficiency. Now consider this carefully. If chemically speaking, human fat and animal fat share similar properties, if both can undergo saponification, if both can produce glycerin, if both can burn, then scientifically the distinction is moral, not functional. And morality, in periods of scarcity or desperation, has always been negotiable. There is no evidence of widespread, formalized industrial processing of human fat in ordinary circumstances. Let's be clear about that. But there were moments, disasters, wars, epidemics, when bodies accumulated faster than burial systems could manage. Flooded graveyards, collapsed hospitals, battlefields. And whenever the natural order of burial is disrupted, bodies begin to be seen differently, as problem, as sanitation issue, as matter to be dealt with. In some documented cases, particularly during the 19th century, adipocere formation in crowded cemeteries created logistical challenges. Coffins reopened to reveal wax-like remains. Burial grounds had to be relocated. Chemical processes became municipal concerns. City officials consulted chemists. Chemists consulted factories. The body, once sacred, had entered administrative discussion. Even if it was not routinely harvested, it was analyzed, measured, understood as substance. And something shifts in the human mind when understanding replaces mystery. Fear diminishes, curiosity rises, utility whispers.
Adipocere also fascinated early forensic investigators because in preserving features, it preserved evidence. In murder investigations, the wax-like transformation could slow decay long enough to identify victims. So, here lies another paradox. The same process that unsettled graveyards advanced justice. The same chemistry that could reduce a body to components could also preserve identity. Science, as always, stood neutral. It described, it did not judge. And yet the knowledge accumulated. By the mid-1800s, chemists fully understood how fats could be broken down, purified, and reconstituted. Industrial processes became increasingly efficient. Soap manufacturing expanded globally. Companies like Procter & Gamble built fortunes refining animal fat into household necessity. The world was becoming mechanized, urban, industrial. Human bodies were no longer surrounded primarily by ritual, but by infrastructure. Hospitals, factories, railways, workhouses. The dead moved through systems, and systems are built on processing. The science of body fat, its chemical stability, its combustibility, its transformability, did not automatically lead to exploitation, but it removed ignorance. And ignorance is often the final barrier between reverence and repurposing. When people once believed decay was mystical, they hesitated. When decay became chemistry, hesitation softened. Adipocere is not evil. It is simply what happens when fat meets moisture and time. But its discovery marked something larger. The moment humanity realized that even in death, the body obeyed predictable chemical laws. It could be studied, altered, rendered. The transformation of fat into wax became symbolic of something deeper. The transformation of the human form from sacred mystery into measurable matter. And once something becomes matter, it becomes manageable. And once it becomes manageable, it becomes available. The grave, once thought final, was now understood as laboratory, and the laboratory rarely closes its doors once opened. We are still moving slowly through this story, but feel how the air is changing. We began with medicine, desperate and intimate. Now we stand at the threshold of industry and chemistry. The body is no longer just healing the living, it is being analyzed for its components. And history has shown us again and again, when a resource is identified, someone will eventually ask how to use it. The question is no longer whether the body can transform. We know it can. The question is who decides what that transformation is for.
Chapter 4: War and the Myth of Human Fat Factories. War does something to the imagination. It stretches it, distorts it, feeds it. In peacetime, rumors struggle to survive scrutiny. In wartime, they thrive in the absence of certainty. And by 1914, Europe was no longer a continent of crowded lecture halls and quiet laboratories. It was trenches, barbed wire, artillery that shook the earth for miles. World War I did not simply consume soldiers. It consumed resources: metal, coal, rubber, oil, glycerin. Glycerin, in particular, became crucial. It was a key component in the production of explosives, especially nitroglycerin. And glycerin, chemically speaking, could be derived from fats. Animal fats were already processed in rendering plants across Europe. Carcasses were broken down efficiently. Nothing wasted. Hooves to glue, bones to fertilizer, fat to soap, candles, lubricants, and chemical processing. Industrial society had mastered conversion. But by 1917, after years of relentless warfare, shortages were everywhere. Food was rationed. Soap was limited.
Factories strained to maintain supply lines disrupted by blockades and bombings. And into that climate of scarcity came a story. In April 1917, British newspapers reported something chilling. They claimed that Germany was operating a facility designed to process the bodies of fallen soldiers into fat, oil, and other useful byproducts. A corpse factory. The alleged plant was described as a Kadaververwertungsanstalt, a carcass utilization factory. It was said to be located near Gelsenkirchen. The reports were graphic. Bodies transported by rail, lowered into vats, rendered for glycerin, converted into soap. The story spread rapidly. Headlines inflamed outrage. Sermons condemned barbarism. Allied propaganda seized upon it as proof of enemy depravity. The idea struck something primal, because by this point in history, the concept did not feel impossible.
Chemistry had advanced. Rendering plants existed. Industrial processing was common. The war had already introduced mechanized slaughter on a scale never before seen. If machines could grind men into mud on the battlefield, could industry grind them further? That was the terror. The accusation tapped into a fear already simmering beneath the surface of modernity, that industrial society, stripped of morality, might reduce human beings to raw material. But here is where we slow down, because history requires precision. The word cadaver in German typically referred to animal carcasses, not human corpses. The facility described in Allied reports was almost certainly an animal rendering plant, a standard industrial operation processing livestock remains. After the war, investigations revealed that the story had been exaggerated and amplified through British propaganda channels. It had originated from misinterpretations and possibly deliberate manipulation designed to weaken enemy morale and strengthen Allied resolve. In 1925, British officials quietly acknowledged that the corpse factory narrative had been false, fabricated, weaponized. And yet, the reason it gained traction so easily is revealing. The public did not reject the story as absurd. They believed it, because the war had already normalized the unthinkable. Trench warfare had turned men into statistics. Casualty lists filled newspapers daily. Entire villages lost generations of sons. The human body had already been reduced to numbers. So when a rumor suggested further reduction from soldier to soap, it felt like a logical extension of industrial brutality. The myth was powerful because it was plausible, and in that plausibility we glimpse something unsettling. Industrial rendering was not inherently evil. It was efficient, practical, necessary for feeding cities and maintaining hygiene. But the existence of such facilities meant society had already accepted the idea that flesh could be processed at scale. The moral barrier separating animal from human rested not on chemistry, but on principle. And war erodes principle. It demands sacrifice. It prioritizes survival. It reframes cruelty as necessity. Even though the specific story of a German human fat factory was propaganda, the anxiety it triggered revealed deeper fears about modernity itself. The 20th century had introduced assembly lines, mass production, mechanized efficiency. Human labor was measured in output per hour. Human bodies were fitted into uniforms. Human lives were calculated in strategic value. The rumor of rendering the dead was horrifying, not because it was chemically innovative, but because it symbolized total dehumanization. The body no longer sacred. The body no longer mourned. The body reduced entirely to function. War had already blurred the line between individual and instrument. The corpse factory myth pushed that logic to its most grotesque extreme. And here is where we must tread carefully. Because while the World War I story was false, the 20th century would later witness very real atrocities involving the exploitation of human remains under totalitarian regimes. The lesson is not that such fears were irrational. It is that propaganda often draws power from proximity to possibility. It amplifies what already feels dangerously close. By the time the myth was publicly corrected, the damage had been done. The image lingered in collective memory. Trains of bodies, industrial vats, fat converted into wartime supply. Even today, the phrase human fat factory conjures immediate revulsion. But what truly disturbs us is not the false report itself. It is the environment that made it believable. A world where factories ran day and night, where chemicals transformed flesh into product, where governments managed death at scale. The myth thrived because the groundwork, technological and psychological, had already been laid. Modern war had shown humanity's capacity to mechanize destruction. The leap from battlefield to vat did not seem impossible. And that is the heavy truth in this chapter. The story was propaganda, but the fear behind it was real. War had taught society that the body could be spent, used, calculated. And once that lesson is learned, it does not disappear easily. It lingers long after the cannons fall silent. The myth of human fat factories tells us less about what happened in 1917 and more about what people believed modern civilization was capable of becoming. Because in the smoke of industrial war, humanity glimpsed a future where morality might bend beneath machinery, where chemistry and efficiency could override reverence, where even the dead might not escape utility. The rumor was false, but the unease it exposed was not. And as we move forward, we must remember something essential. History does not require truth to create fear. It only requires plausibility. And by the early 20th century, the transformation of flesh into resource no longer felt like fantasy. It felt like something the modern world might, under the right pressure, justify. That pressure would not disappear. It would simply change form. And neither would the question. When survival demands resources, what lines remain uncrossed?
Chapter 5. Urban Legends and Panic in the 19th Century. Fear does not require proof. It requires possibility. And in the 19th century, possibility was everywhere. Cities were swelling beyond anything previous generations had known. Industrialization pulled rural populations into dense urban centers. Streets grew crowded. Housing compressed. Sanitation struggled to keep pace with growth. And with density came death. Cholera outbreaks swept through neighborhoods with terrifying speed. Tuberculosis lingered like a quiet shadow. Influenza, typhoid, and industrial accidents filled hospitals faster than they could empty. The dead moved through cities in numbers that strained systems designed for slower times. Funerals became hurried. Burials became shallow. Records became inconsistent. And in environments where death was frequent and poorly managed, rumor found fertile ground.
The 19th century became an age of urban legend, not the modern internet variety, but whispered stories carried through markets, alleyways, factory floors, and candlelit kitchens. Stories about the body, stories about disappearance, stories about what happened after death. In parts of Eastern Europe, particularly in regions of Poland and neighboring territories, tales circulated of individuals known as fat thieves, shadowy figures accused of abducting victims or stealing bodies to harvest body fat. The Polish phrase "łapacze tłuszczu," loosely translated as fat catchers, appeared in local folklore. Parents warned children not to wander alone. Travelers reported hearing whispers of strangers who targeted the vulnerable, the poor, the homeless, the sick. These stories were rarely substantiated, but they did not emerge from nothing. They grew from an atmosphere of mistrust. Authorities often removed bodies quickly during epidemics to prevent disease spread. Wagons collected the dead at night. Burial sites overflowed. Mass graves were sometimes necessary. To officials, this was sanitation. To grieving families, it looked like disappearance. In cities like Warsaw, cholera outbreaks intensified public suspicion. When bodies were taken for rapid burial, families feared they would never see their loved ones again. In such conditions, rumors flourished that authorities or unknown actors were exploiting the dead. Fat specifically became the focus of certain legends because of its known industrial and medicinal value. By the 19th century, most people understood that animal fat fueled soap production and candle making. They knew fat could be rendered and repurposed, and knowledge breeds speculation. If animal fat had value, could human fat have value too? The question lingered in the collective imagination, unanswered but unsettling. Similar legends emerged in Latin America, particularly in Argentina and Peru, where stories of the sacamantecas, literally fat extractors, became deeply embedded in folklore. These figures were said to prey upon travelers, children, or isolated villagers, harvesting fat for industrial use or foreign buyers. Like many urban legends, details varied wildly. Some versions described strangers with surgical tools, others depicted government conspiracies, still others framed fat thieves as agents of foreign industries seeking exotic resources. The consistency was not in the facts, it was in the fear. Fear that the body, even in death, was no longer protected. Fear that poverty made one vulnerable not only in life, but afterward. Fear that industrial society valued materials more than people. Urban legends often reflect cultural anxieties rather than documented events, and the 19th century was a period of profound anxiety. Industrial machines replaced manual labor. Factories demanded relentless output. Cities restructured daily life. The individual began to feel small within vast systems. And when people feel powerless within systems, they imagine those systems capable of hidden cruelty. Body-snatching scandals of earlier decades had already eroded public trust. Families knew graves could be disturbed. Medical institutions had demonstrated willingness to use unclaimed bodies. Executioners had sold human fat as medicine. These were not myths, they were facts. Urban legends simply extended those facts into darker territory. Stories of fat thieves symbolized a deeper cultural fear, that modernization might strip away dignity, reducing individuals to components within industrial machinery. And sometimes legends intensified during moments of crisis. During epidemics, municipal authorities often imposed strict burial protocols. Bodies could be transported without family presence, coffins sealed quickly, graves dug hastily. To officials, this was public health. To communities, it felt secretive. Rumors filled informational gaps. Whispers suggested that bodies were not reaching cemeteries intact, that organs were removed, that fat was extracted, that strangers profited from tragedy. Most of these accusations lacked evidence, but that did not diminish their emotional truth. Because rumor does not seek verification, it seeks explanation. When events feel opaque, people create narratives that restore a sense of understanding, even if that understanding amplifies fear. It is important to note that organized, widespread fat theft targeting living individuals for industrial purposes lacks historical documentation. The legends often exaggerated isolated incidents or misinterpreted medical practices. Yet the persistence of these stories reveals something significant. They expose a growing discomfort with how modern society handled death. Funeral traditions were shifting, medical institutions were gaining authority, industrial needs influenced resource management. The body, once surrounded by intimate rituals, was increasingly processed through bureaucratic systems, and bureaucracy, by its nature, feels impersonal. Urban legends emerge when intimacy disappears. The figure of the fat thief became a symbolic antagonist, a personification of faceless systems perceived to exploit the vulnerable. Whether real or imagined, these stories articulated fears that could not easily be expressed through direct accusation. It is also worth noting that many legends disproportionately targeted marginalized groups as victims. The poor, migrants, and rural populations appeared frequently in these narratives, reflecting existing social inequalities. If anyone could be exploited unnoticed, it would be those already invisible. And invisibility breeds fear. Urban legends simply extended those facts into darker territory. Stories of fat thieves symbolized a deeper cultural fear that modernization might strip away dignity, reducing individuals to components within industrial machinery. And sometimes, legends intensified during moments of crisis. During epidemics, municipal authorities often imposed strict burial protocols. Bodies could be transported without family presence, coffins sealed quickly, graves dug hastily. To officials, this was public health. To communities, it felt secretive. Rumors filled informational gaps. Whispers suggested that bodies were not reaching cemeteries intact, that organs were removed, that fat was extracted, that strangers profited from tragedy. Most of these accusations lacked evidence, but that did not diminish their emotional truth. Because rumor does not seek verification, it seeks explanation. When events feel opaque, people create narratives that restore a sense of understanding, even if that understanding amplifies fear. It is important to note that organized, widespread fat theft targeting living individuals for industrial purposes lacks historical documentation. The legends often exaggerated isolated incidents or misinterpreted medical practices. Yet the persistence of these stories reveals something significant. They expose a growing discomfort with how modern society handled death. Funeral traditions were shifting, medical institutions were gaining authority, industrial needs influenced resource management. The body, once surrounded by intimate rituals, was increasingly processed through bureaucratic systems. And bureaucracy, by its nature, feels impersonal. Urban legends emerge when intimacy disappears. The figure of the fat thief became a symbolic antagonist, a personification of faceless systems perceived to exploit the vulnerable. Whether real or imagined, these stories articulated fears that could not easily be expressed through direct accusation. It is also worth noting that many legends disproportionately targeted marginalized groups as victims. The poor, migrants, and rural populations appeared frequently in these narratives, reflecting existing social inequalities. If anyone could be exploited unnoticed, it would be those already invisible, and invisibility breeds fear. Urban legends about fat thieves persisted into the early 20th century, adapting to new contexts. As industrial technology advanced, rumors evolved to incorporate machinery and foreign industries. In some communities, tales of fat extraction became warnings about modernization itself. The body, once protected by tradition, seemed increasingly exposed to economic logic. But here lies the complexity. Urban legends are not reliable historical records. They are emotional records. They capture what people feared might be happening rather than what definitively occurred. And sometimes the fear is more revealing than the fact. The 19th century was a transitional era, poised between traditional societies grounded in ritual and modern societies driven by efficiency. During such transitions, uncertainty creates psychological tension. The fat thief legend embodies that tension. It reflects anxiety about science without full understanding, industry without transparency, medicine without consent. The figure lurking in folklore is less a literal criminal and more a metaphor for a world in which bodies could be commodified. And that metaphor resonated deeply, because history had already shown that the boundary between sacred and practical was negotiable.
Grave robbing had occurred. Corpse medicine had existed. Industrial rendering plants operated openly. Urban legends simply asked a haunting question. If society had crossed those lines before, what lines might it cross next? The panic surrounding fat thieves was not purely irrational. It was the psychological echo of a world undergoing rapid change, a world where death moved faster, where institutions grew larger, where individuals felt smaller. And in that shrinking space between person and system, rumor became a coping mechanism, a way to articulate unease, a way to reclaim narrative control, a way to voice the suspicion that modernity might carry hidden costs. The legends may not have reflected widespread organized crime, but they reflected something equally real, a collective fear that in the march toward progress, the human body might lose its sanctuary. That fear would not vanish, it would evolve, because as we move forward, the forces shaping these legends, industrial demand, medical advancement, and social inequality, will intersect in increasingly tangible ways. The fat thief may have lived primarily in folklore, but the anxieties that created him were grounded in history.
Chapter 6. The Industrial Value of Fat. Industry does not ask what something means. It asks what something does. Can it burn? Can it lubricate? Can it clean? Can it preserve? If the answer is yes, it has value. By the 19th century, fat had become one of the quiet engines of industrial life. Not glamorous, not celebrated, but everywhere. Before petroleum dominated global markets, rendered fat, primarily animal-derived, powered daily existence in ways most people never considered. Candles illuminated homes and streets. Soap maintained hygiene in rapidly growing cities. Textiles relied on lubricants to keep machinery functioning. Leather processing required fats for treatment and preservation. Chemical manufacturing extracted glycerin from fats for explosives and industrial compounds. Fat was infrastructure, invisible but essential. Rendering plants became common across Europe and North America.
Livestock carcasses were processed efficiently, with every usable component extracted. Bones became fertilizer, hides became leather, hooves became glue, and fat was melted down in vast vats, purified, separated, and repurposed into countless products. The process was industrial alchemy, transforming biological matter into economic utility. Companies like Procter & Gamble rose to prominence through soap and candle production, industries built on the reliable supply of animal tallow. Entire urban economies became intertwined with rendering operations that operated day and night. The smell of rendering plants was unmistakable, a heavy, sweet, greasy odor that lingered in industrial districts. It clung to clothing, drifted through alleyways, settled into brick and timber. It was the scent of transformation, the scent of conversion. And beneath that conversion was a quiet philosophical shift. Industrial society normalized the idea that biological matter could be systematically processed, efficiently, predictably, without sentiment. Animals had long been used for sustenance and material, but industrialization amplified the scale. What was once local and artisanal became mechanized and centralized. Large facilities replaced small workshops. Output increased dramatically.
The logic was simple. Nothing wasted, everything utilized, maximum efficiency. Now pause, because within that logic lies a subtle unease. When an industrial system becomes skilled at converting organic material into useful products, it develops an infrastructure capable of processing flesh. Any flesh. Chemically speaking, fats share similar properties across species, whether derived from cattle, pigs, sheep, or humans. Triglycerides behave predictably under heat and chemical treatment. They can be rendered, saponified, separated into fatty acids and glycerin. Science does not moralize, it categorizes, but society does. And that moral boundary separating animal from human relies entirely on cultural principle rather than chemical distinction. This does not mean human fat was a standard industrial resource. It was not. But the existence of industrial fat processing created a framework in which such an idea could be imagined. And imagination, once introduced, rarely retreats. There were moments in history where this framework intersected with desperation. Famines, wars, and humanitarian crises created environments where bodies accumulated faster than traditional burial systems could manage. Mass casualties strained institutions and challenged ethical norms. In such contexts, scattered reports emerged suggesting exploitation of human remains for practical purposes. These accounts are often fragmented, localized, and difficult to verify comprehensively, but they illustrate the vulnerability of moral boundaries during extreme circumstances. Scarcity alters perception. When resources dwindle, materials gain heightened value. Soap shortages during wartime, for example, led governments to collect animal fats aggressively from households and food industries. Public campaigns encouraged conservation and recycling of fats for industrial and military use. Fat was not luxury, it was necessity. The industrial value of fat extended beyond domestic life into warfare. Glycerin derived from fats played a critical role in explosive production. Lubricants maintained machinery essential to military logistics. Soap became a public health priority in crowded barracks and hospitals. Fat supported both survival and conflict. This dual role intensified its perceived importance. The Industrial Revolution had introduced a worldview centered on efficiency. Waste was failure. Productivity was virtue. Materials were evaluated based on output potential. And as cities grew larger and systems more complex, individual awareness of material origins diminished. People used soap without considering rendering plants, burned candles without imagining vats of melted fat, purchased lubricated machinery without thinking of biological sources. Distance from production creates psychological comfort. But industrial infrastructure remained silent, capable, neutral. There is a quiet irony here. Industrial fat processing improved sanitation, supported urban growth, and enabled technological progress. Soap reduced disease transmission. Lubricants powered factories that produced essential goods. Explosives shaped geopolitical outcomes. Fat contributed to modernity itself. Yet the very efficiency that delivered these benefits also revealed something unsettling: the human capacity to convert life into material with remarkable detachment. Industry does not inherently dehumanize, but it requires abstraction. Raw materials are categorized, quantified, transported, and processed through systems that prioritize output over narrative. A rendering plant does not know the story of a carcass. A chemical vat does not reflect on origin. A factory ledger records weight, not identity. And when societies become accustomed to abstraction, moral boundaries can feel less tangible. This is not to suggest that industrial fat processing naturally leads to human exploitation, but it establishes conceptual possibility. The infrastructure exists, the chemistry is understood, the economic value is clear. The barrier becomes ethical. And ethics, history teaches us, are not fixed. They are negotiated within cultural, political, and economic contexts. The industrial value of fat illustrates how biological materials became embedded within global economic systems. It demonstrates how organic matter could be standardized, commodified, and distributed at scale. The body, once primarily associated with ritual and identity, increasingly intersected with material logic. That intersection is where discomfort resides. Because while most industrial fat originated from animals, the existence of a system capable of converting flesh into commodity invites difficult questions. Questions about dignity, about boundaries, about what distinguishes sacred remains from usable matter. These questions rarely surfaced openly in industrial discourse, but they lingered beneath the surface. Urban legends about fat thieves, wartime propaganda about corpse factories, and historical practices of corpse medicine all reflect a shared anxiety that industrial efficiency might one day erode moral distinction. The industrial value of fat did not create exploitation, but it created context, a world where flesh could be rendered, where chemistry overshadowed symbolism, where material function often outweighed emotional significance, and context shapes imagination. By the late 19th century, society had internalized a subtle understanding. The human body is biologically composed of substances with measurable utility, fat among them. This knowledge did not automatically translate into action, but it altered perception. The body was no longer purely mystery. It was chemistry, structure, component. And once a body is understood as component, the question inevitably arises: component of what? Industry answered with practicality. Medicine answered with knowledge. Folklore answered with fear. And history, as we move forward, will show how these answers begin to overlap in ways both subtle and unsettling. The industrial value of fat is not a story of cruelty. It is a story of efficiency. But efficiency, when applied without reflection, has the potential to redefine boundaries societies once believed immutable.
The rendering vats of the 19th century did not process human bodies, but they revealed something profound, that the transformation of flesh into commodity was technically simple. And when something is technically simple, human history suggests it will, at some point, be morally tested.
Chapter 7. Medical Ethics and the Anatomy Acts. Public outrage does not always stop a practice. Sometimes it reshapes it. By the early 19th century, grave robbing had become impossible to ignore. Newspapers printed stories of disturbed burial grounds. Families guarded graves for nights after funerals. Iron cages, mort safes, covered coffins like prison bars turned downward into the earth. Fear of resurrectionists was not superstition. It was lived reality. Medical schools continued to expand, and the demand for cadavers remained constant. Anatomy had become central to surgical training, and physicians argued, often correctly, that understanding the body saved lives. But society was facing a contradiction. Medical progress required bodies. Public morality demanded respect for the dead. And somewhere between those positions, tension escalated into scandal. The infamous crimes of William Burke and William Hare in Edinburgh crystallized public fear. Their murders, committed to supply fresh cadavers for anatomical study, exposed a chilling reality. Demand for bodies had created incentive for exploitation. The scandal forced lawmakers to confront a difficult truth. Prohibiting grave robbing without addressing medical demand would not solve the problem. It would simply push the trade deeper underground. And so, reform began. In 1832, Britain passed the Anatomy Act, legislation designed to regulate the supply of bodies for medical education. The act permitted licensed anatomists to dissect unclaimed bodies from workhouses, hospitals, and prisons. On paper, the act addressed multiple concerns. It reduced grave robbing, it supported medical training, it introduced oversight into anatomical practice. But laws rarely operate only as intended, because the Anatomy Act shifted the burden of dissection away from criminals and toward the poor. Unclaimed bodies overwhelmingly belonged to individuals without family resources. Workhouse residents, hospital patients, prisoners, and the destitute became the primary legal source of cadavers. The wealthy retained funeral rights. The poor became educational material. The act did not explicitly target class, but class shaped its impact. In cities like Manchester and Liverpool, protests erupted as working-class communities realized that poverty could determine one's post-mortem fate. Fear shifted from grave robbers to institutions. The anxiety was no longer that strangers might steal bodies, but that the state could claim them. For many, this felt like an extension of social inequality beyond life itself. Death, which had once represented a universal equalizer, appeared stratified. Ritual for some, dissection for others. The Anatomy Acts also introduced new ethical complexities within medicine. Anatomists were no longer operating entirely in shadows, but the shift from illegal acquisition to legal appropriation did not eliminate moral discomfort. Instead, it reframed it. Physicians defended dissection as necessary for medical advancement. Surgical mortality rates were high, and anatomical ignorance carried life-threatening consequences. Understanding internal structures allowed doctors to operate more safely, diagnose more accurately, and develop new treatments. The benefits were undeniable. Yet the process of obtaining bodies raised uncomfortable questions about consent. Could the absence of claim be interpreted as permission? Did poverty negate autonomy?
Was society justified in prioritizing the health of future patients over the dignity of those who died unclaimed? These questions lingered in medical discourse, rarely resolved but frequently acknowledged. Hospitals and workhouses became pivotal spaces in this ethical landscape, institutions that cared for society's most vulnerable populations also became primary sources of anatomical material. The boundary between care and utilization blurred. Medical students learned from bodies that may have lived lives marked by hardship and invisibility. The irony was profound. Those marginalized in life continued to serve society in death, often without recognition or consent. And yet, progress followed. The regulation of cadaver supply reduced the violent incentives that had fueled grave robbing. Anatomical education became more standardized. Medical schools operated with greater transparency. Surgical innovation accelerated throughout the 19th century. Lives were saved. Pain was reduced. Knowledge expanded. The Anatomy Acts did not represent moral failure, but they did represent moral compromise.
Societies often navigate progress through compromise, balancing competing values rather than achieving perfect resolution. The acts illustrate how legal frameworks can address practical problems while introducing new ethical dilemmas. They also reflect a broader transformation in how the body was perceived. The dead body became institutional resource, not commodity in a commercial sense, but material within educational infrastructure. This distinction matters. There was no widespread industrial market for human fat or tissue under the Anatomy Acts. The purpose remained academic and medical. But once the body entered institutional systems as regulated material, it became easier to conceptualize its components as separate from identity. Fat removed during dissection was rarely central to anatomical study. It was typically discarded. Yet the act of dissection itself reinforced a subtle conceptual shift. The body could be divided into parts, each with distinct functions and potential uses. Division encourages abstraction. Abstraction encourages detachment. Medical students learned to see tissue through analytical lenses, muscle, organ, nerve, fat, rather than as components of a once living person. This cognitive framing was necessary for clinical competence, but it also created emotional distance. That distance, while functional within medicine, contributed to broader societal unease. Communities worried about what happened behind anatomy theater doors. Transparency improved compared to the era of resurrectionists, but secrecy remained. Anatomy rooms were not public spaces. The transformation of bodies into educational material occurred largely out of view. And what happens out of view invites speculation. Rumors persisted that anatomical institutions exploited the vulnerable. While many such claims were exaggerated, they reflected genuine concerns about consent and dignity. The memory of grave robbing and corpse medicine had not faded entirely. The Anatomy Acts marked a turning point in medical ethics, not because they resolved all tensions, but because they formalized them. They acknowledged that the human body could serve scientific purposes after death. They recognized the necessity of regulation. They exposed social inequalities embedded within medical systems. Modern medical ethics, with its emphasis on informed consent and body donation, emerged gradually from these debates. Public trust required transparency. Voluntary donation replaced involuntary acquisition. Institutional oversight strengthened ethical frameworks. But the path toward these standards was neither linear nor immediate. The Anatomy Acts represent an era of transition, a period when society grappled with competing priorities: respect for the dead, advancement of medical knowledge, and management of social inequality.
They also highlight a recurring theme within this story. The body's value extends beyond life. Whether as educational material, medicinal resource, or industrial component, human remains have repeatedly intersected with societal needs. The ethical challenge lies not in denying that value exists, but in determining how it is acknowledged and governed. The Anatomy Acts attempted to answer that challenge through law, but law cannot fully resolve moral discomfort. It can only structure it. And as we continue forward, we will see how the legacy of these reforms shaped public perception of bodily autonomy, institutional trust, and the boundaries between reverence and utility. The grave robbers faded. The executioner's remedies diminished. The anatomy theaters gained legitimacy. Yet beneath these developments remained a quiet awareness. The human body, even after death, had entered systems of use, not through conspiracy, not through malice, but through necessity, progress, and compromise. And compromise, history reminds us, always leaves questions in its wake. Questions about who benefits, who consents, who is remembered, and who, quietly, becomes part of the machinery of advancement.
Chapter 8: The Psychology of the Body as Resource. There is a difference between knowing something and feeling it. Most of us understand intellectually that the human body is biological matter. We learn anatomy in school. We see diagrams of muscle and bone. We accept that organs can be transplanted, blood donated, tissue studied. But emotionally, we hold a different belief, that the body is sacred, personal, untouchable. That belief is not scientific. It is cultural, and culture, unlike chemistry, evolves. Throughout history, societies have oscillated between reverence and practicality when confronting the human body. Ritual burial, cremation, embalming, and mourning practices reflect attempts to preserve dignity and identity beyond death. But parallel to these rituals runs another current, quieter, more pragmatic: the recognition that the body contains material value. This recognition is not inherently sinister. Organ donation saves lives. Medical research advances treatment. Forensic science solves crimes. These uses reflect ethical frameworks built on consent and collective benefit. Yet the psychological discomfort remains. Because the moment we acknowledge material value within the body, we confront a tension between personhood and substance. The 19th and early 20th centuries intensified this tension dramatically. Industrialization, urbanization, and medical advancement transformed how individuals related to their own bodies and the bodies of others. Factories measured workers by productivity. Armies measured soldiers by deployability. Hospitals categorized patients by diagnosis. Governments recorded populations through statistics. The individual body became data, useful data. And when bodies are framed as units within systems, abstraction follows. Abstraction is a psychological mechanism that enables humans to manage complexity. It enables surgeons to operate without emotional paralysis, scientists to conduct research objectively, and institutions to administer care efficiently. But abstraction also creates distance, distance between identity and material, distance between person and component. The psychology of the body as resource emerges from this distance. It is not a conscious decision made collectively. It is a gradual shift, one that occurs when societies prioritize function alongside meaning. Consider the language of modern life.
We speak of human resources, of labor force, of manpower.
Even in contemporary discourse, the body is frequently framed in utilitarian terms: productivity, health metrics, physical capability. These concepts reflect a worldview in which the body is evaluated based on performance. This framing is not inherently dehumanizing, but it reveals how easily material logic integrates into cultural perception. Historically, moments of crisis accelerate this integration. War reframes bodies as instruments of defense. Industrialization reframes bodies as engines of production. Medical advancement reframes bodies as sources of knowledge. Each reframing serves practical purposes, but each also subtly reshapes psychological boundaries. The stories explored throughout this narrative, corpse medicine, grave robbing, urban legends, industrial rendering, and anatomical legislation, collectively illustrate how societies negotiate the body's dual identity as both person and material. These negotiations rarely occur explicitly. They unfold through behavior, through policy, through rumor, through institutional practice. The figure of the fat thief, whether literal or folkloric, symbolizes anxiety about this negotiation. It represents the fear that material logic might override personal dignity, that in extreme circumstances, bodies could be reduced entirely to resource. This fear is not irrational. It reflects historical memory. Humans have repeatedly witnessed contexts in which material necessity overshadowed ritual reverence. Epidemics required mass burial. War demanded rapid casualty management. Industrial systems prioritized efficiency over sentiment. Each context introduced psychological dissonance. How do we reconcile reverence for the individual with practical management of mortality at scale? There is no simple answer. Instead, societies develop coping mechanisms. Ritual is one such mechanism. Funeral rites reaffirm identity even as the body transitions into biological matter. Legal frameworks, such as body donation protocols, establish consent as ethical anchor. Cultural taboos reinforce boundaries that prevent commodification. But beneath these structures lies an uncomfortable truth. The human body is both symbol and substance, and acknowledging one dimension does not eliminate the other. The psychology of the body as resource is shaped by awareness of this duality. It is the mental balancing act between honoring personhood and recognizing biological function. For medical professionals, this balance is navigated daily. Surgeons must detach emotionally to perform procedures, yet remain ethically grounded in patient dignity. For industrial societies, the balance manifests in regulatory frameworks governing tissue use, research ethics, and mortuary practices. For individuals, it appears in personal decisions about organ donation, burial preferences, and end-of-life care. But tension persists. Urban legends about fat thieves, rumors of corpse factories, and public anxiety surrounding anatomical dissection all reflect deeper psychological concerns. They articulate fears that abstraction might erode empathy, that systems might prioritize utility over identity. These fears often intensify during periods of rapid change. The 19th century witnessed unprecedented transformation. Traditional community structures weakened as urbanization fragmented social networks. Institutional authority expanded. Scientific knowledge challenged long-held beliefs about the body and death. In such environments, uncertainty fosters speculation. Speculation fosters myth, and myth reveals emotional truth, even when factual basis is limited.
The legend of the fat thief expresses a psychological boundary, a line people fear society might cross. It reflects the discomfort of imagining one's body reduced to raw material without consent or ritual. But psychology also reveals something more nuanced. Humans possess remarkable capacity to contextualize material use when framed within ethical narratives. Organ donation is widely accepted because it aligns with altruism. Medical research gains legitimacy through informed consent. Forensic investigation is supported because it serves justice. In each case, the body as resource is integrated into moral frameworks that preserve dignity. This suggests that discomfort arises not from material use itself, but from perceived loss of agency. Consent becomes the dividing line. The historical episodes explored earlier often involved absence of consent, unclaimed bodies, grave robbing, executioner-derived remedies. These practices generated unease because they bypassed individual autonomy. The psychology of the body as resource is therefore deeply intertwined with trust. Trust in institutions, trust in ethical frameworks, trust that material use will not override personal dignity. When trust erodes, anxiety intensifies. Urban legends flourish, rumors spread, fear amplifies. And history demonstrates that trust is fragile. The industrial era introduced systems capable of processing biological material at scale. Medical advancements required anatomical study. Governments developed bureaucratic mechanisms for managing populations. These developments created benefits, but also generated psychological unease about depersonalization. The body, once understood primarily through ritual and community, became embedded within systems of analysis and management. And systems, by design, emphasize efficiency. The challenge for societies is maintaining empathy within efficiency.
The psychology of the body as resource ultimately reflects humanity's ongoing attempt to reconcile material reality with symbolic meaning. It is the recognition that flesh is biological matter while simultaneously representing identity, memory, and personhood. This dual awareness produces discomfort, but discomfort can be protective. It prompts ethical reflection, encourages regulation, reinforces cultural boundaries. Without discomfort, societies risk normalizing practices that erode dignity. Throughout this narrative, we have observed how historical contexts tested those boundaries. Medical necessity justified dissection. Industrial efficiency prioritized material conversion. Wartime propaganda exploited fears of dehumanization. Urban legends expressed anxiety about institutional power. Each episode reveals how perception of the body shifts under pressure. But the enduring theme is not exploitation, it is negotiation. Societies continually renegotiate the meaning of the body in response to changing technological, medical, and economic realities. The psychology of the body as resource is not static. It evolves. And within that evolution lies a quiet but essential question. How do we preserve reverence in a world that increasingly understands biology through the lens of chemistry and utility? There is no definitive answer, only awareness. Awareness that the body carries both material and symbolic significance. Awareness that ethical frameworks must adapt alongside technological advancement. Awareness that history's discomforts serve as cautionary reminders rather than anomalies. The fat thief, whether historical figure or folkloric specter, represents the fear of imbalance.
the moment when material logic eclipses moral reflection. But fear also serves a purpose. It encourages vigilance. It reminds societies that progress without empathy risks eroding the very dignity it seeks to protect. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson embedded within this chapter. The human body can be studied, healed, and even serve others after death. But it must never lose its identity as more than material. Because once identity disappears, the boundary between resource and person becomes dangerously thin. And history has shown us how fragile that boundary can be. Chapter 9. What was real? What was myth? History does not arrive neatly labeled. It rarely tells us with certainty where truth ends and imagination begins. Instead, it leaves fragments, documents half-preserved, rumors half-recorded, accounts shaped by fear, propaganda, grief, and memory. And when we look back across centuries, those fragments blur into narrative. The story of human fat thieves exists in that blurred space, somewhere between documented practice, cultural anxiety, and mythic exaggeration. To understand it, we must slow down, not to dismiss the stories, but to examine them carefully, because fear often contains truth, even when the story itself does not. Let us begin with what was real. Corpse medicine, particularly in early modern Europe, is well documented. Apothecaries sold preparations derived from human remains. Executioners rendered fat from the bodies of the condemned and marketed it as ointment for joint pain and injury. This was not rumor, it was practice. It reflected a worldview in which the body retained therapeutic potential after death. The belief may appear unsettling through modern ethical lenses, but within its historical context, it represented a genuine attempt to relieve suffering. Equally real was the trade in cadavers for anatomical study. Grave robbing was widespread during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Medical institutions relied on resurrectionists to supply bodies in the absence of legal alternatives. The public fear surrounding disturbed graves was not paranoia, it was justified. The Anatomy Acts later legalized the use of unclaimed bodies, formalizing practices that had previously operated in shadow. These reforms did not eliminate ethical tension, but they confirmed that the human body had become integral to medical education. Also real was the scientific understanding of fat as valuable biological material. Fat fueled candle production, soap manufacturing, lubrication, and chemical industries throughout the Industrial Revolution. Chemists studied fat composition, and industrial systems developed efficient rendering processes. Fat was resource, undeniably. Now, consider the next layer.
Urban legends about fat thieves, stories of individuals abducting victims or harvesting fat from corpses for industrial purposes, are far less substantiated. Historical documentation does not support widespread organized networks engaged in systematic human fat harvesting. But these legends did not emerge from pure invention. They grew from context in which bodies had been stolen, context in which corpse-derived medicine existed, context in which industrial rendering plants operated, context in which medical institutions utilized unclaimed remains. Legends filled the gaps between observed practices and imagined possibilities. They amplified fear where transparency was limited. And fear, once embedded in narrative, becomes persistent. The myth of human fat factories during World War I illustrates this dynamic clearly. The British propaganda story describing German facilities rendering soldier corpses for industrial use was later revealed to be false.
The alleged factory near Gelsenkirchen processed animal carcasses, not human remains. Yet the myth endured, because it felt plausible. Industrial society had already normalized large-scale rendering processes. War had already demonstrated humanity's capacity for mechanized destruction. The idea of extending industrial logic to human remains did not feel impossible. Myth gained traction through proximity to reality. And this is where historical interpretation becomes delicate. Dismissing all rumors as fiction ignores the emotional truths they reflect. Accepting them uncritically risks distortion. The historian's task lies between these extremes, acknowledging both the documented practices and the cultural anxieties that shaped narrative. The truth surrounding human fat thieves is therefore layered. Human fat was used medicinally in certain contexts. Cadavers were exploited for anatomical education. Industrial systems rendered animal fat at scale. Urban legends exaggerated the scope of exploitation. Wartime propaganda weaponized fear. Each layer contributed to the broader narrative. None alone defines it. It is also important to recognize how memory transforms history. Stories passed through generations often prioritize emotional resonance over factual precision. A grandmother's warning about fat thieves may not reflect documented events, but it captures inherited anxiety about bodily vulnerability. Such stories become part of cultural identity. They persist not because they are verifiable, but because they articulate fear. Fear that institutions may exploit the powerless. Fear that modern systems may reduce individuals to components. Fear that death does not guarantee dignity. These fears are not unique to the 19th or early 20th centuries. They are timeless. And they explain why the narrative of human fat thieves continues to captivate modern audiences. It touches a fundamental psychological boundary, the belief that the body retains sacred status beyond life. Stories that challenge this belief provoke discomfort, but discomfort invites inquiry.
When examining what was real and what was myth, we must also consider the role of silence in historical record. Many practices involving human remains occurred in contexts where documentation was minimal or intentionally suppressed. Hospitals, workhouses, and industrial facilities did not always maintain transparent records accessible to public scrutiny. Absence of documentation does not automatically confirm absence of practice, but neither does it validate rumor. This ambiguity fuels narrative complexity. Historians rely on available evidence, cross-referencing sources, and contextual analysis to distinguish between documented practice and speculative interpretation. In the case of human fat thieves, evidence supports limited medicinal use and anatomical exploitation, while large-scale industrial harvesting remains unsubstantiated. The myth, however, carries symbolic significance. It reflects the cultural unease surrounding modernity's capacity to commodify biological matter. Industrialization, medical advancement, and bureaucratic systems introduced frameworks in which bodies could be managed, studied, and processed. The myth exaggerates this framework into dystopian narrative, but exaggeration often reveals underlying concern. The narrative of human fat thieves is therefore less about literal industry and more about perceived trajectory. The fear that material logic might eventually eclipse moral boundary. This fear is not confined to historical past. Contemporary debates surrounding biotechnology, organ markets, and medical ethics echo similar anxieties.
The question remains persistent. How do societies balance scientific progress and material utility with respect for individual dignity? The historical record does not provide definitive answers, but it offers cautionary insight. It demonstrates how practices considered acceptable within one era may appear troubling in another. Corpse medicine, once mainstream, is now obsolete. Grave robbing, once tolerated in shadow, is condemned. Anatomical dissection, once controversial, is regulated through consent-based donation. Ethical frameworks evolve, and myth often marks the boundaries of that evolution. The story of human fat thieves ultimately occupies a liminal space, neither wholly factual nor entirely fictional. It is a composite narrative formed through documented practices, cultural anxiety, propaganda, and folklore. Its persistence reflects humanity's enduring discomfort with viewing the body through purely material lens. And perhaps that discomfort serves a purpose. It encourages scrutiny, promotes ethical reflection, prevents complacency. Because history teaches us that moral boundaries are rarely static, they are negotiated repeatedly across generations. What was real reminds us of vulnerability. What was myth reminds us of fear. Together, they illuminate the psychological landscape of societies navigating technological and cultural transformation. The task is not to eliminate myth, but to understand why it exists. And in understanding, we uncover something deeper than factual accuracy. We uncover the emotional truths that shape collective memory. The narrative of human fat thieves endures because it speaks to a universal concern, the desire to preserve dignity beyond death, even in a world increasingly governed by efficiency and material logic. It asks us to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that the boundary between person and resource is not fixed. It is maintained through culture, ethics, and vigilance. And history, when examined closely, reveals how easily that boundary can be questioned. The truth is not that human fat thieves operated vast industrial networks. The truth is more subtle, that fragments of reality, when filtered through fear and uncertainty, can create myths powerful enough to shape cultural consciousness for generations. And sometimes, the myth tells us more about ourselves than the fact ever could. Chapter 10. The Legacy of the Human Fat Thieves. Some stories end with resolution. This one does not. Because the story of the human fat thieves was never truly about theft alone. It was about boundaries, invisible ones. The lines societies draw between reverence and practicality, between personhood and material, between memory and utility. And those lines, history shows us, are not permanent. They shift, they are tested, reinforced, sometimes crossed, often renegotiated. The legacy of the human fat thieves is therefore not a record of an industry or a conspiracy. It is a record of discomfort, a lingering unease born from centuries of witnessing the human body move through systems of use, medicine, science, industry, and war in ways that challenged traditional notions of dignity. Throughout this narrative, we've encountered fragments of that legacy. Corpse medicine, where human fat was believed to heal. Grave robbing, where bodies became commodities for anatomical knowledge. Industrial rendering, which normalized the conversion of biological matter into material resource. Urban legends, which amplified fear of institutional exploitation. wartime propaganda, which weaponized anxieties about dehumanization, legal reforms, which attempted to regulate bodily use while exposing social inequality. Each episode contributed to a broader cultural awareness, an awareness that the human body, even after death, carries potential value beyond ritual. And with that awareness came questions. Questions that societies are still asking today. What does consent mean when applied to the dead? Who has authority over bodily remains? How should scientific advancement balance with ethical obligation? Where does resource end and identity begin? These questions did not emerge solely from the historical practices we have explored, but those practices gave them shape. The legacy of the human fat thieves lives less in documented events and more in the ethical frameworks that developed in response to them. Modern medical ethics emphasize voluntary body donation, informed consent, and transparent research protocols. Institutional review boards oversee the use of human tissue. Legal systems protect bodily autonomy even after death. These protections were not inevitable. They were built through discomfort, through public outrage, through debate, through confrontation with practices that felt misaligned with cultural values. History's unease became the catalyst for reform. Yet legacy is not only institutional, it is psychological. The stories of fat thieves, corpse factories, and anatomical exploitation continue to surface in folklore, literature, and modern media because they tap into a deep human fear, the fear of depersonalization. In a world increasingly defined by data, efficiency, and technological advancement, individuals often feel reduced to metrics, health statistics, productivity measures, biological markers. The body becomes quantified, measured, analyzed, optimized. And while these developments bring undeniable benefits, they also echo historical tensions between personhood and materiality. The legacy of human fat thieves reminds us that this tension is not new. It has accompanied every major transformation in medical and industrial history. Industrialization reframed labor as output. Medical advancement reframed bodies as sources of knowledge. Wartime mobilization reframed lives as strategic resources. Each reframing served practical purposes, but each also challenged emotional boundaries. Urban legends persisted not because they reflected documented reality, but because they articulated psychological resistance to these shifts. The fat thief became symbolic, a figure representing the fear that systems might prioritize utility over dignity. Symbols endure because they capture emotional truths, and emotional truths shape cultural memory. Today, societies navigate similar ethical terrain through emerging technologies. Organ transplantation, tissue engineering, biotechnology, and genetic research all rely on understanding the body as biological resource. Yet these practices are embedded within ethical frameworks emphasizing agency and respect. Consent serves as moral anchor. Transparency builds trust. Regulation establishes boundaries. The legacy of historical discomfort informs these frameworks, reminding institutions that progress without empathy risks repeating past mistakes. The story of human fat thieves therefore functions as a cautionary narrative rather than historical indictment. It does not suggest widespread exploitation as norm. It highlights moments when necessity and opportunity tested ethical boundaries.
moments when societies confronted uncomfortable realities about the material nature of the human body, and moments when fear, rumor, and myth filled informational gaps left by institutional opacity. But legacy also carries a quieter dimension. It invites reflection on how individuals perceive their own bodies within modern systems. Are we merely biological entities subject to analysis and optimization? Or do our bodies remain inseparable from identity, memory, and meaning? The answer, as history suggests, is both. The human body exists simultaneously as biological matter and symbolic vessel. Science engages the former. Culture protects the latter.
The balance between these perspectives defines ethical progress. The legacy of the human fat thieves lies in highlighting the fragility of that balance. It reminds us that reverence is not automatic. It must be maintained through ritual, through law, through ethical reflection, through collective awareness. The stories explored in this narrative illustrate how easily perception can shift under pressure. Scarcity, crisis, and technological advancement create contexts in which material logic becomes compelling, but they also reveal how societies respond through protest, through reform, through myth-making that preserves emotional boundaries even when factual certainty is elusive. In this sense, the fat thief is less historical figure than cultural guardian, a symbolic warning about the consequences of forgetting that bodies represent more than biological material. The legacy is not fear, it is vigilance. Vigilance against abstraction that erodes empathy. Vigilance against systems that obscure individual identity. Vigilance in preserving dignity within contexts that demand efficiency. History does not suggest that societies inevitably commodify human bodies, but it demonstrates how easily the possibility can be imagined, and imagination shapes ethical discourse. The narrative of human fat thieves persists because it confronts a universal question. What remains sacred in a world that understands biology through chemistry and industry? There is no definitive answer, only ongoing negotiation. Modern society continues to navigate this negotiation through policy, medical practice, and cultural dialogue. Advances in science expand possibilities for using biological material in ways that benefit humanity, while ethical frameworks strive to ensure those possibilities do not compromise dignity. The legacy of historical discomfort informs these efforts. It reminds us that ethical progress requires memory. Memory of practices that generated unease. Memory of myths that revealed cultural anxiety. Memory of reforms born from public demand for dignity. And, perhaps most importantly, memory of the individuals whose bodies became part of historical processes without recognition. The legacy of the human fat thieves is therefore not a story of exploitation preserved in archives. It is a story of awareness preserved in culture. Awareness that the human body carries both material and symbolic significance. Awareness that progress must remain anchored in empathy. Awareness that dignity does not end with breath. As we close this chapter, the story does not resolve into certainty. It lingers, like a question whispered through generations, a question that modern society continues to answer again and again through ethical choice. How do we honor the body while acknowledging its biological reality? History offers guidance, but not resolution. The legacy remains open, not as warning of what was, but as reminder of what must always be considered.
Because the boundary between resource and person is not defined by chemistry. It is defined by values. And values, unlike matter, require constant care to endure.
Closing, locking the vault. History does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers. It lingers in footnotes, in half-forgotten rumors, in practices that once felt ordinary but now sit uncomfortably beneath modern light. It lives in the spaces between documentation and memory, between fact and folklore, between what was done and what was later questioned. Tonight, we walked through one of those spaces. Not a single event, not a conspiracy with clear edges, not a story with villains neatly defined, but a collection of moments scattered across centuries that reveal how societies have wrestled with a deeply human tension. The tension between reverence and utility. The body, perhaps more than anything else in human experience, exists at the intersection of science and symbolism. It is flesh and identity, matter and memory, biological structure and personal history. And when life ends, that intersection does not disappear. It becomes complicated. Throughout this journey, we encountered the quiet pragmatism of corpse medicine, where belief in healing flesh blurred the boundary between remedy and remains. We stepped into anatomy theaters where knowledge advanced at the cost of unease. We watched industrial systems transform biological matter into resource, not with cruelty, but with efficiency. We listened to rumors carried through crowded streets, where fear filled the silence left by institutions that felt distant and opaque. We saw how propaganda weaponized those fears, turning possibility into narrative powerful enough to endure long after correction. And finally, we examined how societies responded, not with simple answers, but with reform, ethical frameworks, and cultural memory shaped by discomfort. The story of the human fat thieves is not ultimately about theft. It is about perception. About how easily the human body can shift from sacred to practical when circumstances demand adaptation. About how knowledge and necessity can coexist with unease. About how myth emerges not from pure invention, but from the emotional echoes of real historical practices. But perhaps most importantly, it is about boundaries. The boundaries societies construct to preserve dignity in the face of biological reality. The boundaries that separate study from exploitation, use from commodification, science from dehumanization. These boundaries are not fixed. They require vigilance. They require reflection. They require memory. And memory is precisely what stories like this preserve, not to sensationalize the past, but to illuminate the ethical terrain that modern society continues to navigate. Because the questions raised by this narrative are not confined to the 18th or 19th centuries, they remain relevant. Medical technology advances. Biotechnology expands. Industrial systems grow more sophisticated. Data increasingly defines our understanding of the body. With each advancement, societies revisit familiar questions. What is acceptable use? Where does consent begin and end? How do we balance progress with dignity? There are no permanent answers, only evolving conversations. As we close the vault on this story, the air does not clear completely. It lingers with quiet awareness, the recognition that history is not merely a record of what happened, but a mirror reflecting what societies fear, value, and negotiate. The fat thief, whether historical figure or folkloric symbol, represents a cultural anxiety that transcends its specific context.
It embodies the fear of being reduced to material, of losing identity within systems that prioritize efficiency. But it also represents something else, the resilience of ethical consciousness, the fact that discomfort sparked reform, that outrage prompted legislation, that rumor inspired reflection, that myth preserved emotional boundaries where documentation fell silent. The vault, after all, is not a place where stories are buried. It is a place where they wait, waiting to be revisited, re-examined, re-understood. Because history does not disappear when the page ends. It settles quietly beneath modern life, shaping the frameworks through which we interpret new technologies, new policies, and new ethical dilemmas. Tonight, we did not uncover a hidden industry or a forgotten conspiracy. We uncovered something subtler, a history of negotiation, a history of boundary testing, a history of discomfort that ultimately strengthened the ethical structures we rely on today. And perhaps that is the quiet reassurance within this story, that unease is not failure, it is guidance. It is the instinct that prompts societies to ask difficult questions before lines are crossed irreversibly. So as we close this vault, let the silence linger for a moment. Let the story settle. Because the past is not only what happened, it is what we remember, what we question, what we choose to carry forward. If this story stirred your curiosity, unsettled your assumptions, or invited you to see history through a slightly different lens, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories from Story Vault, Buried Truths. There are countless chapters waiting behind other doors, stories buried not because they are unimportant, but because they are complicated. Stories that reveal how humanity evolves not through certainty, but through reflection. And as always,
We will return to open another vault, to follow another whisper, to uncover another piece of the past that refuses to remain silent. Until then, rest easy. But remember, history is never truly locked away. It lingers in quiet corners, waiting for curious minds to notice the dust on the handle. And here in the vault, there is always another door. And don't worry, we promise nothing in here is being rendered. Probably.